Hello lovelies! Today's video is a requested video, and if you want to request that I tackle a particular topic or talk about something in particular, you can make suggestions anywhere, but priority is given to people who back me on Patreon. Just as little as $1 a month gives you access to me to ask questions, suggest videos, gives you discounts on apparel, Postmortem Studios apparel, and on my games and novels and books and various bits and pieces that I do, and some exclusive content. If you look at my postmortemstudios.wordpress.com blog this month, you'll see that we're doing a month of monsters with statistics and stuff for 5th edition D&D, and one for Vampire. There may be other systems as well. So, you know, it's worth it just for $1 a month. That's not much at all. And you support me making these videos and doing the other things that I do. And it's been a tough month, so I could really use the money this month. Anyway, let's get on with the show, and it's going to be important to spell things out and to define some terms first. So bear with me. You'll have to excuse me if I'm not looking straight into the camera so much today. I don't typically work to a script other than bullet points, and with this video I need to really work to a script to make sure that I cover everything, don't repeat myself too much, and make sure that I'm accurate in what I'm saying. So it's a bit of a Heath Robinson setup at my desktop today, so sorry about that. It's also important, I think, for you to understand that I am not going into this defending communism per se. What I'm defending is accuracy of terminology. I'm complaining about misrepresentation. Recently I've been talking about steel-manning people's arguments. If you can attack them at the strongest point that they exist and show that there's flaws there without becoming dishonest or whatever, you have a much better, stronger argument. It's also important going into this to understand what I mean when I use terms like Marxism or socialism or communism. So very quickly, go and do further reading, but as a guide for the purposes of this discussion, Marxism is a theory of history put forward by Karl Marx. It was an attempt to apply scientific thinking to economics and social organization and so forth. At this point, I think we can say that Marxism is a failed hypothesis. That's not how things seem to have worked out. It doesn't have that inevitability that Marxists thought that history would have, that society would have. Things haven't worked out how Marx predicted, which isn't to say that Marxism is entirely worthless in terms of ideas, understanding the value of labour, things like that. It did have insights, but they were really much more valid in the industrialised, exploitative West of the Victorian era, of the late Victorian era, through into the early part of the 20th century. I think they really stopped being relevant or accurate around or after World War II. But yeah, it's a theory of history. Now, Marxists turned that into an active political philosophy whose end goal is, or is supposed to be, the deliberate shoving of economic and social arrangements and organizations towards the end point of the Marxist theory of history, which is communism. Now, Marx thought this was an inevitability, an arrow of history that would inevitably lead to communism. Marxists think this needs a bit of a push, and so that's where they're coming at things. So the end goal of Marxism is communism. What's communism? Communism is a stateless mutuality, where from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, whatever excess production there is shared out, essentially so that the workers get the full value of their labour and aren't exploited. This is the end goal, and the state is supposed to wither away and you're just left with people cooperating, and no need for a lot of the trappings that we think of as being inevitable in society. So that's communism. So communist state is something of an oxymoron, because if there's a state, it can't by definition be communism. What most people think of as communism is state socialism. This is where things get tricky. Socialism has two meanings. There's one that existed prior to Marxism and has continued through Marxism to today, which you might call democratic socialism. This is less extreme. It's about running society in a fair way, but not necessarily by overturning everything. It places a priority on equality and preventing the emergence of new ruling classes. It sees a limited role for the state as an arbiter and adjudicator, and not as ritualistic or controlling of everything. Basically, the state is there to act as a guarantor of your rights as a citizen. The Marxist concept of socialism is very different to that. It's maximally authoritarian. The state controls everything in the name of the people. At least that's the idea. And then after everything has been brought under the control of the state is somehow, by pixie dust and magic, supposed to wither away into a state of communism. So when Marxists talk about socialism, they're not talking about democratic socialism. They're not talking about socialism as practiced in practically every first world nation you care to mention. They're talking about the Marxist concept of socialism. And critics of the left and of communism and of socialism tend to also use the Marxist definition of socialism. I'm not using that definition. I think one thing we can all agree on is that Marxists are cunts. They misuse terminology, they're willing to do just about anything, and they're extremists. But trying to claim that all left-wing philosophy is Marxism or communism just simply isn't true, any more than it's true to say that your average milquetoast centre-right conservative moderate is equivalent to a fascist. But that's all trendy at the moment. Very briefly, before we actually dive into the article, this is going to be a long video. People often ask why people aren't as outraged by the atrocities done in the name of communism, and people wearing communist symbols, like my hat, worn for ironic purposes today. I think the answer to that lies in the same way we look at legal cases. You know, there's what you did and there's the intent. It's the difference between murder and manslaughter. You know, the Nazis had both intent to do harm and did harm. You know, death camps, all the rest of it. You know, invasions, militaristic expansionism, and so on. So they had an evil motive, and they did evil things. Communism is seen to have an altruistic and charitable and good motive, and then things that have gone wrong. So if you like, in the legal analogy, Nazis committed murder with malice aforethought and planned, and the communists committed, or would-be communists committed manslaughter. I think that's why there's a difference in reaction. People ask that a lot, so that just occurred to me this morning. Right, on with the article. And like I said, we're reaching McCarthy-esque levels of fear over left-wing politics. It's a fear not entirely without merit, given the antics of Antifa and so on, and that fits the history. To a great extent, it was left-wing street violence and a fear of communism that drove the rise of the far right in the 1930s. But when it comes to demonizing entire political movements, nobody quite has the viciousness or ignorance of political science, unfortunately, that Americans do. And as this article from Quillette will show, and that's a pity. Quillette is generally slightly more sophisticated, slightly more at the intellectual end of commentary, but not in the instance of this article. Some of that may just be that it's coming from a particularly American perspective, whereas I'm coming at it from a European perspective, but still.
Socialism is having an unprecedented moment in America. Opinion polls show its increasing popularity, especially amongst youths. Membership in the Democratic Socialists of America continues to swell. Mainstream publications such as the Washington Post publish pieces arguing that it's time to give socialism a try, and academics articulate the merits of taking an anti-communist stance. The root cause of each is the same. All people in all times are concerned with flourishing to the greatest extent possible, and in darker times the ever-optimistic views of socialism's proponents have an attractive force, not unlike that of the flame to the moth. As history has shown, this attraction is equally dangerous.
The United States already has some socialist principles at work. There is a welfare state, albeit a much abridged one, and they also have a system that compensates for its lacks and for the American hostility towards even a whiff of socialism or left-wing politics by doing it via the military. So the military provides a way, an exploitative way out for the young and the poor. It can provide an education, VA hospitals, and so on. The military and military towns and the money they bring to the local communities and so on, this is the acceptable face of American socialism, which is unfortunate, but there it is. Service brings citizenship, I guess. And in bad times, people do turn to extremes, but socialism isn't an extreme. As we've pointed out just now, it's already present in the United States, and as we've pointed out previously, it's present to varying degrees in pretty much every first world nation you care to mention. Even places like Monaco, you would think people would all be wealthy enough that they wouldn't need it. You can argue, quite successfully I think, that socialism is, in no small part, responsible for the first world status of a lot of these nations via social investment, social housing, provision of education, health and other essential services. Some people argue that this isn't socialism. I've even heard people call it welfare capitalism. But these things are socialism. Socialism seems to be interpreted by many, particularly in the US, as being the same thing as communism, but as we've belaboured on this channel, even just in the introduction, socialism and communism, socialism and Marxism, these are very separate and different things, and it's absurd to conflate them all together, just as it would be to conflate Nazism with run-of-the-mill conservatism.
Most contemporary socialists, such as Ghodzi and Sehun, in defense of their anti-communism position, do not dismiss the historical crimes of communist states, and recognize that states governed under communist ideology did many bad things. Instead, they seek to defend Marxist socialism against the charge that it is inherently authoritarian, meaning that all such experiments will always and inevitably end with the Gulag, and thereby to save the possibility of political experiments with Marxism that take a non-authoritarian form. They continue to hold out hope that some version of Marxist politics can deliver on its emancipatory promises.
Here I think we do see a differentiation, at least I hope we see a differentiation between the Marxist concept of socialism, which we talked about earlier, the total state control prior to the magic withering away of the state, and socialism as its own ideology with a limited role for the state as a guarantor of equality, fair treatment, equal rights under the law, and so forth. The idea of communism at its end state is also actually inherently anti-authoritarian. Where it fails consistently is in even getting to that stage. Though communes and things that have immediately started at the communist stage have had reasonable amounts of success on a small scale. Socialism varies. It's something that goes along with another way of doing things. So democratic socialism is the default. It's not an oxymoron.
But are the horrible things that have happened in communist countries the natural conclusion of Marxist ideals? Understanding the connection between the philosophical and political facets of Marxism is the question for both those who would call themselves socialists and those who call themselves anti-communists. On one hand, socialists today attempt to sever the theory of communism from its historical practice to preserve the hopes that they see within it. On the other hand, anti-communists understand this historical practice to be inherent to the theory and the hopes of communism to be false. The effort to save communism from its historical record tacitly recognizes that it is worthy of unqualified condemnation. If this record, like in the case of Nazism, is the inevitable consequence of its principles, at least we agree on that much.
There haven't been any communist countries. The very idea of a communist state is oxymoronic. There have been, ostensibly, Marxist countries trying to get to communism and failing hard. So the question's phrased incorrectly. Are the horrors that we have witnessed the inevitable result, then, of Marxist attempts to achieve communism? That, too, is a little bit unsafe, since we can't really say that someone like Maduro or Stalin are really Marxists, given what they've done, what they did, what they are doing in Maduro's case. So finally, then, I guess, to phrase this properly, we have to say, are these issues the inevitable result of communism's failure to be achieved, Marxism's failure to get to that point? I mean, socialism still isn't Marxism. Hammer that point into your head. Some of the resistance to anti-socialist and anti-communist sentiment is rooted in correcting that misapprehension, that dishonest misrepresentation, that straw-manning of socialism. Is it innate in Marxism to end in mass murder and so on, as it did under Stalin? Is it innate in capitalism to end in mass murder, oppression and so forth, as it did under Pinochet? Would or do capitalists even admit to the problems in capitalism, as they expect the left to do for communism or Marxist theory? Must nationalistic ideologies necessarily degenerate into xenophobic or racist violence, as happened with Nazism? Or could, hypothetically at least, these things come about peacefully? The chances of any of these things coming about peacefully probably differs depending on the ideology, and the divisions between people make that less likely, whether it be divisions on wealth, class, race, gender or otherwise. But at least wealth and class, which ties to wealth, at least these are meaningful differences, unlike race.
From the Communist Manifesto, we learn that Marxism may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. This principle is the theoretical and practical sine qua non, as well as that which guarantees every attempt to erect a Marxist system, whether socialist or communist, democratic or totalitarian, will degenerate into an authoritarian nightmare.
It doesn't seem safe to me to claim that this is inevitable at all, especially given that the core of this raft of left-wing ideologies is anti-authoritarian. Voluntarism seems to work on smaller scales, and socialism, as its own ideology, has an inbuilt ideological opposition to the emergence of authority. The concentration of power in capitalism could just as easily be said to lead to authoritarianism in the form of plutocracy and corruption, which is what we seem to be dealing with in a lot of Western nations today.
What is private property? In the simplest terms, ownership is the natural right of an individual to use or dispose of something exterior to his or herself in whatever manner he or she wills. This right emerges from the natural right to life in the following manner. The right to life implies the right of self-preservation, that is, the liberty to act in whatever manner is necessary, effectively, to preserve one's life. It is not simply mere life that is rightfully preserved, rather human beings by nature seek healthy, flourishing life. Life implies the freedom to preserve life, which implies the right to acquire the means of self-preservation. It is not accidental that John Locke speaks of life, health, liberty and possessions in section 6 of his second treatise.
So how might we preserve life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, essentially to the largest degree for the largest number of people? Does this necessitate the existence of private property, or could it be better achieved, or achieved differently at least, by other means? Does the way in which we currently apportion resources, masses for a tiny number of people and tiny amounts for the masses, work best? We simply don't know. That's at least a debate that can be had about what extent and what proportions these should exist in. And the evidence that we do have suggests that somewhere to the left of both the current US and UK political and economic structures is more optimal for giving people opportunities, fulfillment, for the pursuit of happiness, for human flourishing. Let's take life and health as a kind of case in point. To enjoy anything, you need to be alive and reasonably healthy. We know that the best, most cost-effective way to do that is via socialised healthcare. This isn't a debate really anywhere when it comes to people who actually know about these things. That entails that you either have mandated insurance, or a more direct way of going about things is simply taxing and having socialised, nationalised healthcare. Many would say that that approach would be theft or authoritarian, but it grants much more life, much more health, longer average lifespans and so on to many more people than the alternative. So, of these two options, private or public healthcare, which grants the greatest amount of life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness with regard to that in that situation? It doesn't have to be all or nothing. You know, there's many gradations we can go to, we can find the right balance.
That the right to life is the ultimate foundation of private property is seen in the first and most fundamental act of self-preservation, which is at the same time the original act of appropriation, eating. When a human being eats, he takes something that is nourishing and thus intrinsically valuable to all other human beings, and in the process of consuming it, destroys it and transforms it into something devoid of value.
Well, to be super finicky, excrement isn't without value as fertiliser and so forth, but that's me being unfairly nitpicky. What sense does it make to consume much more than you need when others are starving? Does it make sense? Is it moral? Is it ethical to be a glutton while other people are dying of starvation? How should we apportion this understanding of value between people? Surely, if it's in our power, we should work to prevent other people from starving, much as we would like other people to do that for us if we were in that situation. Yeah, if we're able, that's something we should do, right? Well, okay, that's the thin end of the wedge, that charitable urge, that altruism, that desire to reduce the suffering of others, that reciprocity, that golden rule, upon which most of us can agree. This is the same principle, the same urge that informs both socialist and communist, and really any left-wing or liberal, if you want to use the American terminology. It's what drives all of those ideological concepts, albeit in different ways and to different extents. So I don't see that this helps form any kind of effective argument against communism.
But is the private property of the state of nature the same as the private property found in society, or does the move from the state of nature to society beg an important question? Possibly. Marxists today distinguish between personal property, apples, genes, Kenny Loggins records, and private property, the means of production. While libertarians are famous for asserting that all taxation is theft, socialists similarly argue that all private property is theft, and thus they object to enclosure itself as the original theft of what were once common, available public resources. See Jacobin magazine's ABCs of Socialism. For the sake of the argument, let us grant that what is really meant by private property is the means of production, whether land or machine, and that this can be distinguished from personal property. The question is, what justifies the enclosure of the commons? Initially, labour.
I've always found it interesting, kind of fascinating, really, that those on the extreme of the libertarian economic right are so absolutely dead set against the capture of funds, societal economic energy, if you will, the capacity to do work, by the state, but don't have the same kind of outrage about that same capture of funds by private forces, by corporations, companies, and so forth. If it's theft when the state takes perhaps a quarter or a fifth of what you earn and puts it into the infrastructure, defense, and so forth of the country, which you all benefit from, why is it not theft when your boss only pays you perhaps a quarter to a third of what your labour is actually worth? And that's a figure that's roughly typical. And these are more hard questions for the libertarian right, I think. Are you not entitled to the sweat of your brow? If you're worried about the state taking your money, thieving from you, why are you not concerned about private enterprise doing exactly the same thing? The article goes on and on in this fashion, trying to make arguments about what constitutes private property versus public property versus personal property, without ever really addressing the core point of the communists' objection, as I understand it. If you're going to argue with people, it only makes sense to argue with what they actually claim or believe, rather than making things up for them. You know, I'm not a communist. I'm not particularly invested in defending communism. The principle that I'm defending here is that you need to portray your enemies, your ideological foes, accurately and properly, and you need to use terminology properly. So in this situation, this has me defending communists. I don't like defending Trump or Kavanaugh or others either. They are my ideological foes, but there are principles at work as well, and you need to acknowledge when someone does something good or does something well, and that's what I'm doing here.
Marx believed, correctly, that this is precisely the situation into which we are thrown, and that the enclosure of the world makes social revolution inevitable. The have-nots will have no choice but to band together to take from the haves. It's a matter of survival. It's not a matter of if, but a matter of when.
Unless, of course, we manage it. Unless the class, which has acted so very selfishly in the past and the present, can be made to understand that paying their share and investing in society is also in their own self-interest. Does their material greed outstrip their concept of self-preservation? Do they not see these forces at work? Perhaps, but it's either that or the guillotine.
Believing that private property inevitably leads to conflict, Marxism seeks to improve the future by correcting this perceived mistake. That is, it jettisons the idea of enclosure and reaffirms the commons. Socialists fail to understand the causal relationship between the enclosure of the commons, the protection of private property, and the near miraculous increase in the fecundity of the environment that has raised the material standard of living for human beings so dramatically. So they seek to pull up stakes and tear down fences in the belief that the productivity found in a state of natural and voluntary social interaction can be equalled, if not surpassed, in the commons, provided we all work together according to the right plan.
Short of anarcho-primitivists, nobody is really talking about dismantling the things that have increased the value and effectiveness of land and industry, technology, advances in knowledge and so forth. Indeed, it was technology, industrialization and so on that was a big drive in Marx's theory of history, that this would make the industrialized, civilized communism as opposed to primitive communism possible and inevitable. Yeah, he was wrong. There have been pushes back towards ideas of pastoral ideals in Cambodia and China and so on, but these aren't really in line with Marxist theory per se. The thing is, you can maintain technology, you can maintain industry, these things that have multiplied value, but you can also, at least in theory, get even more out by nationalizing or socializing these things, by removing replicated effort and so forth. It may be possible to extract even more value just on the basis of economy of scale, let alone eliminating repeated effort. So you may, in that way, get something closer to the true value of the land and the industry and of people's labour, with a great deal less wastage to boot. You know, this is why people have advocated for nationalised industries, power generation, water, gas, mass transit, things like that. They often do, not always, but often do work better when they're nationalised and when they're run by the people.
And that right there is the problem. Socialism requires unanimity. In other words, like the American founding fathers, socialists seek to solve the problem of faction. In the first instance, socialism seeks to eliminate the most common and durable source of faction, the unequal distribution of property. Moreover, as Schwartz and Schulman argue in their essay Toward Freedom, Democratic Socialist Theory and Practice, socialism seeks to eliminate to the greatest extent possible those sources of faction that arise from the division of labour, by the rotation of menial tasks, frequent sabbaticals, job retraining, shortening the work week, and increasing the creativity of leisure activity. And yet Schwartz and Schulman recognise that there would be a need for expertise, say for surgeons and engineers, and job specialisation under socialism, setting aside the question of whether or not such specialised labour might result in differential rewards and economic inequality, thereby undermining the first effort, that some will hold particular jobs for extended periods of time, even for their entire working lives, will give rise to distinct interests.
This is confusing on both sides. Socialism with communism again, but even under Marxist socialism, or approximations thereof, there have still been experts, specialists, and so forth. Their currency has often been respect and regard. Indeed, places like Cuba and so on have produced a disproportionate amount of doctors, surgeons, and so forth. And countries with socialised healthcare haven't seen collapses in those specialist medical professions. I mean, the NHS in the UK is held to enormous regard, but is a socialist system. This regards this success, even in awful examples of pseudo-communism, if you want to call it that. These are successes even there, despite the protestations of America's private healthcare defenders. This is an extreme, but reducing the capacity of small classes to dominate and shift the arrow of society's direction is preventing totalitarianism, not enabling it.
Specialisation itself raises the connected issue of the diversity in the faculties of men. The fact of human diversity in terms of capabilities, inclinations, opinions, desires and passions guarantees a diversity of interests in every society, provided this diversity is allowed to express itself. Insofar as the success of collectivist economic arrangements depends upon a uniformity of opinions, passions and interests with respect to the common economic goal of the system, any member who dissents is a threat to the whole arrangement. Since support for the socialist system must be unanimous, i.e. total, the liberty to develop one's own capabilities, to follow one's own inclinations, to express one's own opinions, and to satisfy one's own desires must be constrained. Dissent, therefore, merits suspicion, which is why greengrocers will place a sign declaring "Workers of the World Unite" in the window as a demonstration of conformity.
This is perhaps where a valid point is made, albeit there's still the terminological confusion. And this is one of the reasons that I personally believe that the Marxist conceit is doomed to fail in its current conception. Society has to provide room for people, it has to provide safety valves, the possibility for dissent. Dissent itself is also possibility for reform and progress. You cannot expect everyone to agree, and you cannot expect to be able to force them to agree. The other main reason that I think that the Marxist project is doomed to failure because of the over-concentration of power in one place in the Marxist concept of socialism, which makes it uniquely vulnerable to corruption, exploitation and diversion into totalitarianism, as we've seen in Venezuela with Maduro, as we saw under Stalin, as we've seen under Mao in China, and many, many other instances. It's possible for one powerful, charismatic and the ruthless individual to take total power under those circumstances, so that it's not viable as a path to their desired goal, which is communism. But that's the Marxist concept of socialism, not actual socialism.
In other words, because the socialist system cannot give to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions and the same interests, because human nature is an insuperable obstacle, socialism must destroy liberty, and it must do so totally. This is why coercion and control are necessary components of socialism, and why human beings cannot flourish under it, despite being able to do so on the micro level. The good intentions of socialism run up against the hard limits of human nature and reality. In seeking to overcome these limits, socialism necessarily becomes a totalitarian tyranny. Furthermore, it is the worst kind of tyranny, that of the well-intentioned tyrant who tyrannizes you for your own good and with a clear conscience.
We're talking about communism, yet again, here, rather than socialism. Socialism seeks to provide the means for everyone to have the maximal chance of fulfilling their potential. So if you have a baseline, if you know that you're going to have a roof over your head and enough to eat, and if you're provided with an education, these things conspire together, essentially, to provide you with the best possible chance of succeeding and flourishing in life. Indeed, experiments with universal basic income in places like Finland have shown this to be true. You give people a guaranteed baseline, and they're freed up to take more risks, to follow their dreams, to make businesses out of things that they love, rather than just grinding away at the baseline level of coping all the time. So socialism, not communism, but socialism does even out these possibilities, and we know this from the statistics. More socialist countries are more socially mobile. Places like Denmark are much more socially mobile than places like the UK or the US, and the US prides itself on its illusory social mobility. But the truth of the matter is that the more archly capitalist and anti-socialist a nation is, the less social and economic mobility there is. It's just, those are the bald facts.
Returning to the profoundly important question above, what will happen when human beings are born into an enclosed world? What is the alternative to Marxism?
What's the alternative? Post-scarcity, the democratization of technology, Harry Houghton's anarcho-technocracy, forms of left-wing thought like socialism with a more Fabian approach, rather than Marxism, universal basic income. But this was a rhetorical question. Clearly the author has their own ideas.
The short answer is the road actually taken. Rather than late-born individuals resorting to violence to provide for themselves, the enclosure of the commons, the development of agriculture, and the subsequent rise of industry opened a cornucopia of opportunity. What we saw was a revolution, just not the bloody variety.
And now we have the kind of inequality, exploitation and corruption as a result of the status quo that has historically meant bloody and violent revolutions and times of tumult. Because while these things have created more wealth, more and more of that wealth and power has been captured and concentrated in the hands of a very few, just as it has under other systems, under nobles, under merchants, under industrial magnates, and in Marxist states under apparatchiks and party members. This is a human problem, not an ideological problem per se. There are bad actors in every system.
Under conditions of freedom, the economy develops and gives rise to new kinds of economic activity and opportunities. At first, agriculture dominated, but gains in productivity freed up human labour for other pursuits. Then industry arose, leading to even more gains in agricultural productivity and accelerating the shift in where people were employed. This revolution in both agriculture and manufacturing led to higher levels of material prosperity. We also became more and more productive as we got better and better at making things. There was more of everything, and it was better. The service sector exploded onto the scene as someone had to sell all this stuff that was being made by fewer and fewer people. The story culminates, at least for now, in the rise of the knowledge economy and the knowledge worker who finds better ways of doing everything. Each of these economic revolutions was layered upon the ones preceding it and opened new and diverse opportunities that enabled the diversity in the faculties of human beings to better express itself. It is as if no matter what your talent happens to be, today there is a way to monetize it. None of this was planned, nor could it have been, and the process continues with no end in sight.
Now imagine, just imagine, that we could get rid of all the bullshit jobs without banishing people into penury. Imagine if even more people were freed up to pursue the things that they genuinely enjoy and are good at. The argument from tradition and the argument from novelty are both fallacious for good reason, but we have to try new things to see if we can improve upon the status quo. Evolve or die is as true for ideas and societies and nations as it is for animals. There's no reason why there can't be another economic revolution, and it doesn't have to be in the same model, the same way of going about things as previous ones have.
In conclusion, socialists claim that overcoming the bourgeois system would usher in a new way of life, wherein the free development of each was a condition for the free development of all. Overthrow capitalism, ? Utopia. Life in this classless society, we're reassured, would be marked by liberty, equality, and solidarity. The appeal of these universally recognised ends not only captured the imagination of those who believe there must be a final political solution to all human ills, it also justified whatever actions were deemed necessary for bringing this situation about. And yet, in each and every instance over the past century, politically empowered socialism has produced a system of servitude, inequality and suspicion, where the life of a dissenter is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. The socialist experiment has been run and the results are in. It is a failure. Revolution, dictatorship, horror. In fact, we need only compare the lives of those who lived in West Germany to those who lived in the East, or those who live in South Korea to those who live in the North, which is a kingdom of darkness.
The socialist experiment has been run indeed. Germany, modern Germany, is socialist. West Germany was socialist. South Korea is socialist. The examples that the writer gives are failed attempts to get to communism. They're not socialism. This point really needs to keep being hammered home. Furthermore, those nations that are more socialist tend to have the greatest levels of social mobility, the highest scores on the Human Development Index, and generally tend to be healthier, safer, more flourishing, if you will, societies by pretty much any metric that you choose. Marxism might be wrong. Marxist socialism might be nightmarish, but you can't write off everything from the left on the basis of that extreme any more than you can write off the entire right because of the Nazis.
Growing up in an era of unprecedented freedom and prosperity, and living lives that are only possible under such conditions, many Americans of all political stripes simply take for granted the political and economic system bequeathed to them by the dedicated work of their ancestors. Most simply do not understand that prosperity depends upon freedom, that freedom is like water, utterly necessary to flourishing of any and every kind. To push this analogy a bit further, if freedom is like water, then we are like fish swimming within it, and like fish, we pay no mind to the water, despite it being necessary to our very existence.
This may come as a shock to some people, but America isn't a particularly good place to live. It's not to say that there aren't worse places, but there are definitely better places. It's not a good place to live, despite its wealth, certainly compared to many other Western nations. Healthcare is abysmal, mental health care is worse, there's massive military overspend, starving the commons of money. There's not much of a societal or social safety net, even for those who do get subsidised by the military. America is a deeply divided society between the haves and the have-nots, and that kind of division, that kind of lack of care for the populace, gets you both Trump and Antifa, unless you manage real and genuine slow change to heal those rifts and to make life at least a little bit easier for the majority of people, and not in a short-term way but with a long-term vision.
What we do notice, however, is all the dirt that muddies the water. Freedom is messy, it's filled with prudence and foppery alike. When people have the freedom to choose, they do not always make what others would consider to be the right choices. Oblivious to the importance of freedom, many of us are open to the proposals of those who claim it's easy to get rid of the mud by further empowering the state as a means of empowering the individual. Considering only the end, we fail to recognise that the proposed means amounts to draining the lake. When one does not recognise the importance of the water, it is all the more difficult to be convinced of the necessity of cleaning, rather than discarding it. Anti-communism is the refusal to throw out the water. The next step is to figure out how to clean it.
There's more than one kind of freedom, which is something that some people have trouble understanding. Anarcho-capitalism would be an example of one form of extreme when it comes to freedom. Communism, or at least state socialism as they talk about, or it would be an example of another form of extreme freedom. It's freedom to and freedom from. Freedom to do what you want, freedom from deprivation. We need to find a balance between the two that works. And it's not enlightened centrism or radical centrism or whatever you want to call it. That's pragmatism. The way things are right now, we're placing everybody's futures at risk with our short-sighted greed. And if we don't change something, it is going to end up back at the guillotine. Something has to give somewhere in the current way in which society is run. I mean, ideologically, I'm an anarchist. I'm not here to defend Marxism. I'm just here to argue that we need to actually address the arguments that people are making, the positions that they hold, the beliefs that they actually have, rather than strawmanning. And that's what I try to do. I mean, I argue with Marxists. I argue with people on the right as well. Centrism isn't fiddle-faddling on the fence in the middle. It's looking at the world, finding out what works. I'm very much on the left. Like I say, I'm ideologically an anarchist, but pragmatically I'm a socialist in the sense that I mean it. There are things that are better run collectively. There are things that are better run privately. At the moment, the way our society is structured, there is far too much weight available politically to this tiny minority of plutocrats and oligarchs. And we have to do something to address that, but I don't think it should be an extreme snapback the other way. Whether that other way turns out to be fascism or communism. Anyway, if you made it to the end of this long tirade, just leave a comment saying, yes, I made it to the end, and I will see you next time for a shorter and more digestible video. Zang.
Horrible what happened today. See, I don't like the, I have, okay, like a lot of you, I hate a lot. you know? What I hate was style and creativity.
Yeah!